Emmaleigh Barringer's life ended in a way so savage that even the most seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. And Calvin Rudd, the man now accused, would soon become the face of a case so disturbing it shattered the peace of an entire town. On a quiet September morning in the small town of Millersbrook, the stillness was broken by a frantic call to the police. A local jogger, pale and trembling, reported finding something in the wooded area near the edge of the park. Officers arrived within minutes, expecting perhaps an injured animal or a lost hiker. Instead, they were met with a sight that would etch itself into their minds forever. Lying in the undergrowth, partially concealed by fallen leaves, was the lifeless body of 19-year-old Emmaleigh Barringer. Her presence there made no sense. This was a safe, well-traveled spot just a few minutes from her home. But what shocked everyone was not just that she was there, but the brutality of what had been done to her. Her clothing was torn in multiple places, her skin marked by deep injuries, some so severe that detectives later admitted they struggled to comprehend the level of force involved. The air around the scene was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, the kind of detail crime scene investigators never forget. Even the most experienced officers found themselves glancing away, their professionalism straining against the horror in front of them. The crime scene was immediately cordoned off, not just to preserve evidence, but to keep away the growing crowd of onlookers, drawn by the sight of flashing lights in their normally peaceful neighborhood. Emmaleigh had been reported missing less than a full day earlier. Friends had last seen her leaving the college library around midnight, riding her bicycle along the same route she took every evening. It was a familiar path, lit by street lamps, bordered by houses whose windows often glowed with late-night television. She never made it home. What had happened in those missing hours was a question that pressed down on everyone at the scene. But the answers were hidden, scattered somewhere among the leaves, footprints and broken branches. As forensic teams moved in, they began their painstaking work. A small hair clip lay a few feet from her body, bent and broken. Dirt was disturbed in a way that suggested a violent struggle, and faint footprints led away from the scene toward the riverbank. Nearby, the grass was flattened in an irregular pattern, indicating more than one person may have been involved in the movement around her body. Every detail was photographed, tagged and collected, with the hope that anything could point them toward the truth. The medical examiner's initial observations were grim. There were multiple layers of trauma, with injuries in different stages, suggesting she had been alive for hours before her death and subjected to repeated attacks. This was not a random moment of rage. It was methodical, almost calculated. Whoever had done this had taken their time. It was an unsettling realization for the detectives, who were trained to recognize the difference between impulsive violence and deliberate cruelty. Emmaleigh herself had been known in town as quiet and focused. She was a student of forensic science, an irony that did not escape those who now stood over her, documenting the very sort of crime she had dreamed of solving. She volunteered at community events, kept to a small circle of friends and had no known enemies. That made the level of violence even harder to understand. In cases where victims had been targeted, there were usually signs, arguments, financial disputes, or personal grudges. Here, there was nothing obvious. The town of Millersbrook had seen its share of petty crime, but violent crimes were rare, and murders even rarer. To find one of their own, a promising young student, discarded in such a horrific manner, felt almost unreal. Yet the evidence was undeniable. For the detectives, the first hours of any investigation were crucial, and every minute that passed without answers felt like a step further away from justice. The scene was combed again and again, as officers silently vowed to find whoever had committed this act. Still, beneath the urgency lay a darker undercurrent. The sheer ferocity of the injury suggested something personal, an anger or obsession that had built over time. But without leads, the possibilities were endless. As the sun began to rise higher, casting sharp shadows through the trees, the investigators knew one thing for certain. Whoever had done this was still out there, and they had started their work with a level of brutality none of them had encountered before. Detectives began piecing together the final hours of Emmaleigh Barringer's life, determined to understand what had led her to that dark, isolated patch of the park. They started with the last confirmed sighting, surveillance footage from the college library parking lot. The grainy video showed Emmaleigh unlocking her bicycle just after midnight, glancing briefly over her shoulder as if sensing something behind her. In the far corner of the frame, barely visible, a faint figure stood still, their shape indistinct in the dim light. Seconds later she pedaled away and vanished from view, leaving behind only the eerie stillness captured by the camera. The path from the library to her apartment was one she had taken countless times before. It wound through quiet streets, past a handful of closed shops, and eventually joined a well-lit main road. Friends told detectives she was cautious, never straying into alleys or shortcuts. Yet somewhere along the way that night, something had gone terribly wrong. There were no reports of screams or disturbances. No witnesses came forward to say they had seen her being followed. It was as though she had simply slipped into the darkness. Her roommate described changes in her behavior during the weeks before her death. Once relaxed and open, Emmaleigh had become more withdrawn. She double-checked door locks, avoided late-night outings unless necessary, and sometimes jumped at unexpected noises. When pressed, she dismissed it as stress from her workload and late study nights. But detectives knew such shifts could point to something more, a growing fear she hadn't shared with anyone. A search of her phone uncovered a disturbing detail. Over the past month, she had received a series of anonymous text messages. Each was short, with a tone that grew increasingly ominous. "I see you. You can't hide. It's almost time." The messages had no contact name and came from a prepaid phone that had been activated 2 towns away. Cell tower data provided no useful location. The sender had been careful, using multiple areas to avoid detection. The last message was sent at 12:00 minutes after she left the library. "Ready to meet?" Investigators suspected she had been stalked, possibly for weeks. The messages indicated not only forethought, but also a confidence that suggested the sender felt close to carrying out a plan. If this was the same person who had attacked her, the violence had been intentional, premeditated. The question was how they had first encountered her. Digging deeper, detectives learned that Emmaleigh had been volunteering once a week at a local support group for victims of violent crime. She had joined earlier that summer, hoping to gain insight into the experiences of survivors as part of her studies. The meetings were open to anyone, and attendance varied. Some were genuine victims seeking help. Others came for less clear reasons. This realization unsettled investigators. It meant that her personal information and habits might have been observed by people she didn't know well. Lists of attendees were reviewed, and among the names, one in particular stood out: Calvin Rudd, a man with a prior conviction for aggravated assault. He had been released from prison only 8 months earlier, and was on supervised parole. He had attended several sessions in the same weeks as Emmaleigh. Neighbors later reported seeing him loitering near her apartment building on more than one occasion. When questioned, Rudd claimed he barely remembered her, saying they might have been in the same room once or twice. His alibi for the night of the murder was vague. He insisted he had been home, but no one could verify it. Detectives found his calm demeanor unsettling. They knew that stalkers often blend familiarity with calculated patience, waiting for the moment when they can act without interference. The surveillance footage, the messages, the shifts in her behavior, all of it painted a picture of a young woman under quiet siege. She had not confided in the police or even her closest friends, possibly fearing she was overreacting. But with each new discovery, detectives grew more certain that the brutality they had seen in the park was not random. It had been the culmination of something that had been building, step by step in the shadows. And somewhere within that slow, unseen buildup was the key to finding her killer. The investigation turned sharply toward Calvin Rudd, as detectives began to connect more unsettling details from his past to the circumstances surrounding Emmaleigh Barringer's murder. His criminal record painted a disturbing picture. 5 years earlier, he had been convicted of aggravated assault against a young woman in a neighboring county. The attack had been sudden and vicious, leaving the victim with lasting injuries. Witnesses in that case had described Rudd as unpredictable, prone to violent outbursts, and disturbingly calm afterward. The parallels between his previous crime and the brutality inflicted on Emmaleigh were impossible to ignore. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Rudd's apartment and vehicle. The apartment was small, dimly lit and cluttered. On the surface, nothing directly tied him to the murder, but subtle details caught the investigators' attention. A pair of heavy work boots sat near the door, their soles caked with dried mud. In the corner, a battered duffel bag contained rope fibers and a partially used roll of duct tape, the same type found in fragments near Emmaleigh's body. The most chilling discovery was tucked inside a drawer beneath old magazines, a notebook filled with unsettling sketches. Each page depicted bound women in various settings: woods, abandoned buildings, dimly lit rooms. One image bore an uncanny resemblance to the wooded area where Emmaleigh had been found. His car, a faded green sedan, yielded even more troubling evidence. In the trunk, forensic teams discovered strands of hair that matched Emmaleig's color, along with tiny fibers consistent with her clothing. Though these thinnings were compelling, they still lacked the irrefutable certainty of DNA. Detectives knew they had to be thorough. Rushing the case could mean the difference between conviction and a suspect walking free. In interviews, Rudd maintained a steady composure, offering minimal responses. He denied knowing Emmaleigh beyond seeing her in passing at the support group. When asked about the notebook, he shrugged, claiming the rarings were just ideas for a graphic novel he hoped to create. He had no explanation for the rope fibers or the duct tape, saying they were leftover supplies from odd jobs he occasionally did. His answers were plausible enough to keep him from immediate arrest, but the lack of emotion in his voice unsettled the detectives. As the days passed, investigators traced his movements in the weeks leading up to the murder. Surveillance cameras from various points in town revealed that his car had been spotted near Emmaleigh's apartment building on at least three occasions late at night. One camera even caught him parking across the street and sitting in his car for over an hour without getting out. In each instance, his vehicle was positioned where he would have had a clear view of her front door. Further examination of his phone records uncovered gaps, periods, where the device was either turned off or left in areas with no signal coverage. Detectives suspected these times might align with the harassment messages sent to Emmaleigh, though proving it would require more digital forensics. They also began interviewing members of the support group, hoping to learn more about his interactions with her. Several attendees recalled that Rudd often sat in the back, rarely speaking, but keeping his eyes fixed on certain participants. One woman remembered Emmaleigh shifting uncomfortably whenever Rudd entered the room. She had never mentioned him directly. While the pieces were starting to form a troubling pattern, the investigation remained trapped in a frustrating middle ground. They had a strong suspect, a disturbing history, and suspicious behavior, but the case was still circumstantial. Prosecutors warned that without direct forensic evidence linking Rudd to the crime scene, a defense attorney could dismantle the case in court. This uncertainty only strengthened the detectives' resolve. They returned to the evidence again and again, certain they had not yet uncovered the crucial link that would close the gap. In the meantime, Rudd walked free, moving about the same streets and neighborhoods where Emmaleigh had once felt safe. The knowledge that he might still be watching someone else cast a shadow over the entire town, and investigators knew they were racing against the clock before another tragedy occurred. Just when it seemed the case might stall, a breakthrough emerged from an overlooked detail. Forensic analysts, working methodically through every piece of evidence, discovered microscopic paint fragments embedded in the skin of Emmaleigh Barringer's hands. At first they were assumed to be environmental, possibly from a railing or a bicycle part. But testing revealed something unusual. The paint was an uncommon shade of dark teal, with a specific chemical composition used in vehicle interiors during a short production run over a decade earlier. Only a handful of models had ever used it, and one of them was Calvin Rudd's faded green sedan. This discovery hinted at a violent struggle inside or near the vehicle. It also suggested that Emmaleigh had fought back fiercely, scraping against the painted surface as she resisted. Investigators immediately re-examined Rudd's car, focusing on the interior panels. Under forensic lighting, faint scratches and smudges became visible along the inside of the rear door. Some of the marks contained traces of what appeared to be dried blood, too degraded for immediate testing but promising nonetheless. Despite the significance of this find, it still wasn't enough to secure a conviction. Detectives needed a direct link, DNA, fingerprints, or a personal belonging that placed Rudd at the scene beyond doubt. With that goal, they decided to revisit the park where Emmaleig's body had been discovered. This time, they expanded the search perimeter, combing areas that had initially seemed irrelevant. It was during this renewed effort that an officer noticed something partially buried beneath a rotting log near the riverbank. Carefully, they unearthed a weathered backpack. Inside, wrapped in a thin plastic bag, was Emmaleig's missing phone. The device was water-damaged, but intact enough for forensic recovery. Analysts worked for days extracting data, while fingerprint experts dusted the exterior. The results were damning. Partial prints belonging to Calvin Rudd were found along the phone's edges. Given the context, there was no plausible explanation for his prints to be there. Simultaneously, another piece of evidence surfaced. Days after Emmaleig's disappearance, her bicycle had been found downstream, tangled in debris. It had initially been dismissed as unrelated since the location was far from where her body was found. But now, with renewed scrutiny, forensic swabs from the handlebars revealed traces of blood. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Rudd. The pattern suggested he had been struck during a struggle, possibly when she tried to escape. The evidence was finally beginning to form a chain that prosecutors could use. The paint in her wounds, the fingerprints on her phone, the blood on her bicycle, all of it converged toward one conclusion. Rudd had been with Emmaleigh the night she died, and their interaction had turned violent. Detectives confronted him again, presenting the new findings. His responses shifted noticeably. Where before he had been calm and dismissive, now he seemed guarded, his answers clipped and inconsistent. He claimed he had once helped her carry the phone after a meeting, an explanation that collapsed under the weight of the timeline. He also insisted the blood on the bicycle was a coincidence, suggesting he had cut his hand near the river days earlier. It was an implausible defense, and he seemed to know it. Prosecutors began preparing for trial, confident the case was finally strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Yet, lingering questions troubled the investigative team. The sheer level of brutality in the attack went far beyond what was necessary to subdue or silence a victim. It suggested a deeper, more personal motive, one rooted in obsession, anger, or both. Why Emmaleigh specifically had been targeted was still unclear, and whether she had known the danger she was in until it was too late remained a haunting uncertainty. As the community learned of the new evidence through cautious public statements, relief began to replace fear. The man suspected of shattering their sense of safety was no longer just a shadow in the background. He was a name, a face, and soon he would be standing trial. For the detectives who had walked through every grim detail of the case, there was satisfaction in closing the distance between suspicion and proof. But with that satisfaction came the knowledge that even when justice was served, the memory of what they had seen in those woods would remain with them forever. When the trial began, the courthouse in Millersbrook became the center of attention for the entire county. Reporters filled the steps outside, their cameras trained on the heavy wooden doors as people shuffled in. Inside, the air was tense, the gallery crowded with townspeople who had followed every twist of the investigation. At the defense table sat Calvin Rudd, dressed neatly but expressionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point rather than on the jury that would wed his fate. Across from him, prosecutors prepared to lay out the chain of evidence that had taken months to assemble. The opening arguments painted two starkly different pictures. The prosecution described a calculated predator who had stalked Emmaleigh Barringer for weeks, possibly months, before executing a plan to abduct, torture, and kill her. They detailed how Rudd's prior conviction for violent assault fit a disturbing pattern, and how his presence at the support group meetings had given him a perfect opportunity to observe her without arousing suspicion. The defense, in contrast, tried to portray the evidence as circumstantial and incomplete, insisting there was no definitive proof placing Rudd at the exact moment of her death. One by one, the prosecution called witnesses to the stand. Forensic experts explained how microscopic paint fragments embedded in Emmaleig's skin matched the rare interior coating in Rudd's car. A crime lab technician described the painstaking process of recovering data from her water-damaged phone and how Rudd's partial fingerprints had been found on its casing. Another expert recounted how DNA testing confirmed that blood found on her bicycle's handlebars belonged to Rudd. Each testimony built on the last, tightening the web of evidence until it seemed unbreakable. The most haunting moment came when the jury was shown photographs from Rudd's notebook, the disturbing sketches of bound women in secluded settings. One image mirrored the wooded location where Emmaleig's body had been found. The prosecution argued that these drawings were not harmless fantasies, but visual blueprints for the violence he later carried out. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom, and several jurors avoided looking directly at the images. The defense countered with their own witnesses, attempting to cast doubt on the forensic findings. They suggested the fingerprints could have come from an innocent interaction, that the paint chips might have transferred from an entirely different occasion, and that the blood on the bicycle could have been the result of an unrelated accident. But each explanation felt increasingly strained against the weight of the combined evidence. As the trial progressed, a darker side of Rudd's behavior emerged. Prosecutors revealed that he had installed a hidden camera near the college library parking lot months before the murder. The recovered footage showed him filming various women, but Emmaleigh appeared repeatedly, often in the same late-night time frame when she studied at the library. This surveillance pattern, they argued, proved his growing fixation and methodical planning. Closing arguments left the jury with a clear choice. The prosecution urged them to see the crime for what it was: a deliberate act by a man who sought control, who escalated his obsession until it ended in unimaginable brutality. The defense asked for reasonable doubt, warning against convicting on what they framed as a chain of coincidences. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and stalking. The judge sentenced Rudd to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the community of Millersbrook, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but little comfort. The details of the case had been too graphic, the violence too extreme to fade quickly from memory. The park where Emmeleigh's body was found became a place people avoided after dark, its shadows now associated with fear rather than peace. Emmeleigh's family channeled their grief into action, establishing a scholarship for students pursuing forensic science, a tribute to her ambition and determination to help victims. Detectives who worked the case admitted privately that it was unlike anything they had encountered before, not only because of the brutality but because of the chilling patience with which it had been carried out. Even with justice served, the story of Emmaleigh Barringer remained a grim reminder of how danger can hide in plain sight, waiting for the moment to strike.